We interrupt this performance of the Chicago Philharmonic with this bulletin from the WPOD Newswire. Dateline, Chicago. What started as a simple yet risky investigation into the death of a Capone mobster, Dwarf detective Billibob Baddins has uncovered the theft of an artifact from his own realm of Acryonis, a black market operation run by the curator of the Ryerson Museum and himself under the watchful eye of the United States government. Billy feels the need to step away from all this, and with an invitation extended by Ava Rothschild, his client's high society foil, our hero is about to be treated to a night on the town. And now you know the story so far. We return you to our regularly scheduled programming here on WPOD, Chicago.
Chapter 12. I'll Live a Lush Life. One of the few things dwarves do because they have to, not because they want to, is attend fancy dress events. Break out the kilt, find the medals and pendants of past glories, and then it's beard braiding time. The dwarves of Gryffinos only pulled out the formal military duds from the mothballs for royal appointments, a presentation of a family crest, or the coronation of an emperor. We never did this sort of thing for fun. When we threw a party, we dwarves liked to be comfortable. Trust me, it's never a good idea to pass out in leather armor and a kilt. Perhaps I was really tempting the fates by attending this dinner party. But here's the thing, I'm one of those few dwarves who really enjoy getting dressed up for no good reason. Because of that, and because my pal Sergio handles a needle and thread with the same flair as a blade master with a sword, I couldn't help but wear a smug little grin. I didn't have to ask. I knew. I looked good. Promptly at 7, a scarecrow of a chauffeur knocked on my office door and accompanied me down to a sharp silver and steel gray limo idling at the curb of my building. Damned impressive sight. When I arrived at the party, the valet didn't seem to care that I wasn't up to par, or height, with the other guests. I could have been a mountain troll stepping out of that ride and he would have still greeted me with the same look. He had a job to do, and intended to do it to the best of his ability, so that the Rothschilds would invite him back to the estate. Whenever they needed a valet, that is. As my feet lightly scuffed against the stone surface of the manor's wide steps, the tall double doors in front of me opened wide like the jaws of a great dragon in full roar. I couldn't help but dwell on that image for a moment. The prospect of entering this beast of splendor and indulgence was giving me a severe knot in the stomach. No doubt Miss Rothschild had an agenda in inviting me to her hallowed halls. Maybe it was just to aggravate her old man. That was fine with me because I had my own reasons for being here too. All I knew was this. Once I stepped across her threshold, I had to be sure I could handle whatever waited for me on the other side. I don't know how long I stood there. I think 3 couples passed by me. They could have been laughing at me or enjoying an early start to the evening's revels. I preferred to think the latter. Inside, I could hear a string quartet striking up a movement from The Four Seasons. Winter, from the sound of the slow, relaxing melody. Probably the Largo movement, so the cellist could steal a bit of the spotlight. Why should the violins have all the fun? Hey, I'm a tough-talking detective, not some socially challenged orc who can't appreciate a good tune. The enthusiastic proclamation,
Mr. Baddins, you made it!
pulled me back from my own private abyss. Before me stood Ava Rothschild, extending a flute of champagne to me with a bright smile. As for my hostess, she was very much like the house, classical, caressing contemporary. Her long blonde tresses were swept up and away from her face, now fresh and soft-looking. While she didn't sport the bob that many women of this world embraced, she evidently had no qualms in embracing the latest fashions. If her plunging neckline number, probably the latest rage from Paris, was anything to go by. An interesting contradiction Miss Rothschild was proving to be. Smoothing out the front of my double-breasted tuxedo as I walked up to her, I couldn't help but smile at her approving look. I took the glass from her, raised it in a silent toast, and took a sip. Even filled with the fine sparkling wine that carried a light, slightly floral bouquet, the glass was as light as a feather. Best crystal that money could buy. Yeah, well, usually a big Saturday night for me involves a talkie and a soda. This is a step up for me, so if I seem a little shy, bear with me. She giggled, smiling even wider as she toasted the couple who followed my entrance.
Mr. Baddings, you hardly strike me as being shy about anything.
Is that a fact? I followed her eyes to the couple she was toasting, a couple I recognized only by face, not by name, from the society pages. Their bright smiles dimmed a little as their eyes fell on me, the dwarf in the tux. While I could dress like their kind, it was clear that I was still far from blending in. Whatever the reason your father had for throwing this little party, I ventured, it must be a big deal. I motioned to a group of couples talking and laughing in the grand foyer. All the gentlemen in this group I recognized as members of the district attorney's and mayor's offices. It would not have surprised me at all if the governor of Illinois were in the next room. So tell me, Miss Rothschild, is my presence here specifically to push Daddy closer to a coronary, and you a little closer to the family inheritance?
Now, Mr. Baddings,
She scolded, resting one of her delicate, bejeweled hands on my shoulder.
your invitation to this gathering is merely a gesture of appreciation.
Appreciation? I didn't buy it for 1 minute that this lady appreciated anything beyond her own wants. Sometime tonight, I was certain the punchline to this joke of me being here would present itself. Until that time, though, I decided to play along. Well, in light of that, I'll tell you what, Miss Rothschild. You call me Billy, and I'll drop the shy, wide-eyed dwarf routine.
Very well, then, Billy.
She touched her glass with mine. The tone rang lightly, a perfect tone that continued to echo like a death toll through the surrounding din of the party.
And you may call me Ava.
With her hand still resting lightly on my shoulder, we went for a stroll around this grand palace. The stunning ornaments along the wall and statues proudly displayed on pedestals in the foyer and adjoining chambers were impressive, but merely the warm-up for what was in the main banquet room. Illuminating the party was a breathtaking crystal chandelier, a fixture casting more than enough light on the various cuisines offered, the bar, like the feds were going to raid this place when the DA and police commissioner were hobnobbing with potential backers, and an impressive collection of pieces that looked like they would be more at home in a museum somewhere. There was no real unifying theme in the pieces here, other than they were rare. After we passed an urn that curators would have begged to prominently display in their own institutions, I turned my attentions back to Ava. She saw the pieces as well, but I saw no appreciation in those crystal blues of hers. In fact, her disregard struck me as rather odd. I could at least appreciate the history behind said artifacts, and the events of this case were only adding to my interest in Rothschild's collection. But Ava seemed more interested in being seen with the dwarf than appreciating the spoils of her numerous digs in Egypt, Europe, and the Orient. When my eyes fell on a beautifully carved jade dragon, I tapped my escort on the wrist and pointed up to it. Now that is a beautiful find, Ava. She shrugged.
If you like that sort of thing, I guess.
All right. It was time to play How Thick is Ava? And find out how much of a sham she really was. But the history behind this piece, I persisted. Just think of it. Ages ago, artisans could craft something like this. I motioned to the serpentine creature. Out of a block of pure emerald.
Yeah, that's really
Ava paused as she stared blankly at the dragon.
something.
And so the painfully small talk went as we passed various relics, with this intrepid, high society archaeologist missing every contradiction and error I threw at her. Clearly, little Miss Ava couldn't tell the difference between a Ming vase and mixed plateware. Guess the apple didn't fall too far from the tree. Much like her ruthless robber baron ancestors, Ava was enjoying her success on the backs of scientists, scholars, and local workers. I couldn't help but wonder how many of those dinks were enjoying fine champagne in expensive crystal goblets tonight. Daddy Rothschild would have really nailed an impersonation of a berserker if he'd known exactly what a waste Ava's education had been in reality. He always made it clear to the papers how much he loathed wasting his money, especially in light of how hard his family had worked in earning it. The Rothschild fortune was built in the oil industry. The family took part in the Great Land Rush and managed a few acres of farmland. Well, as the fates would have it, oil was discovered on their property. Not enough to build the fortune that the Rothschilds currently enjoyed, but enough for Granddaddy Rothschild to invest in Missouri's mining industry. I give old Granddad credit. He didn't put all his eggs in one basket. He invested in several mining operations, and they all brought him a solid income. The harder the Rothschilds' miners worked, the better the Rothschilds lived. And it was apparent that the Rothschilds' miners were working very, very hard. As we passed various pockets of people, my ears picked up bits and pieces of conversation that wasn't far off from the talk I'd hear at Mick's. Only difference was in the details. I caught a few words spoken about a close polo game, which didn't sound very different from talk over the Cubs going into extra innings. Before too long, I heard the ding-ding-ding-ding of a small spoon striking the side of a glass. Conversations came to a halt, the music stopped, and guests' attention gradually turned to the room's large, elegant fireplace, where it looked like a small group of people was preparing to speak. Ava turned to me.
How about I get you a better seat for this moment in Chicago history, little man?
Little man? This was definitely not the same Ava Rothschild who had visited my office the other day. Sure, toots. That was for the little man comment. Normally something like that would have pissed me off, but this was a social event. No need for me to get snippy. How about you get us a place in the front row? As we worked our way through the crowd of tuxedos and evening dresses, I could hear the voice pretty clearly now. While he was getting up there in years, the speaker's deep, confident baritone and dry wit still commanded respect. It was a safe bet that the man flapping his gums would be Franklin Rothschild, the lord and master of this estate. He cracked a joke that I didn't get, but the socialites seemed to get a kick out of it. The politicians I caught sight of laughed politely, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't get the joke either. What a surprise. When we finally made it to the front of the crowd, I saw Rothschild and his wife standing there, quite self-assured in their stance, both physically and socially. From his toothy Cheshire cat smile, it was clear that he was no longer the one doing the talking. No, the guy now addressing the crowd was roughly the same age as Rothschild, but looking as if he could easily dance the Charleston into the wee small hours of the morning. I knew his face from the papers, but I'd already seen so many familiar mugs from the society section tonight that my memory had left the castle for a quick smoke. But the fourth figure standing next to them, I knew at first glance. A shapely socialite with a dress and cleavage that definitely gave my date Ava a run for her money. This raven-haired femme fatale proved to be the punchline to a really bad joke. So tell me, Ava, did you and Miss Lessinger arrange this little rendezvous? Or is her presence at your house and home one hell of a coincidence?
Who said this place was my home? I never made mention of that when I invited you. I just told you I'd send a driver and gave you a time. Nothing more.
This bitch was so lucky there were people around. While I don't believe in hitting women, there are some unique members of the pack who really beg for it. Ava just became the leader of said pack. So, this is the Lessinger estate, huh? Nice digs. My eyes narrowed. You are a true game mistress, aren't you? She merely grinned, quite pleased with herself.
Now, Billy, do you think I would intentionally try and start up trouble between you and your client?
No, provided you nurture some kind of bizarre fetish for 4'1" guys with 36-inch waists, bushy red beards, and hostile attitudes towards goblins. If only the edge in my voice were sharp enough to draw blood. I do think you are capable of painting a picture of me hobnobbing with you in order to outrage your social rival over there, getting her to drop me harder than an elf taking an orc's arrow to the chest. Her smile softened for a moment, only to flood back more radiantly than before.
You are good, Billy.
She bent down to place a gentle kiss on my cheek.
I look forward to having you on my payroll.
I remained indifferent along with the rest of me. The kiss was specifically for Miss Lessinger's benefit, because she had just caught sight of me in the tux. It was a shock, I'm sure, to find me there. That shock increased tenfold at Ava's empty gesture.
The words reckless
Shaken,
and
my
tunnel
client
vision
returned her
would
gaze
best
to the
describe my
onlookers,
life,
as
my
Henry
values.
Lessinger continued to address the
I
party.
believed myself the lone maverick of industry. But as I grow older and wiser, well, all right, as I grow older, I'm finding it harder and harder to move forward on my own. Lessinger Industrial and Technological Development has provided jobs for the workers of America and advancements for the world. But lately I believe we are growing too comfortable. We are not moving forward fast enough, and I believe that two kings work better than one. Alliances have always proven to be the future of business, society, and nations. After all, it was an alliance that brought an end to the Great War in Europe.
Yeah, a war that America refused to get involved in until their hand was forced. And what was with the two kings comments? He apparently didn't know the kings of my realm, who went to war over the position of a tree stump and an invisible line in the ground. I'm sure he meant well, but old Lessinger really needed to lay off the booze, because his tipsy state was altering his take on reality. Franklin Rothschild, the earlier voice we heard, now chimed in.
Therefore, for the betterment of the country, and for the future of my children,
He quickly glanced over to Ava with a transparent smile.
and perhaps one day grandchildren,
She returned the nicest
Screw you and the mount you rode in on, Dad.
smile I'd ever seen on a lady.
I am announcing tonight the partnership between Rothschild Oil and Mining Industries and Lessinger Industrial and Technological Development.
There was a slight gasp from the assembled guests as the men clasped hands. Flashbulbs burst around them like forest pixies who, at the time of their deaths, explode at night in a fleeting brilliance and then return to Earth in a shower of sparks. The smiles and nods the two tycoons shared were sincere. So sincere that I think it frightened many of the partygoers. Even outside these upper-crust social circles, it was well known what bitter business rivals these men were. This announcement was marking the end of an era of underhanded, cutthroat struggles for financial supremacy in Chicago. Whether or not this new relationship would usher in a new age of cooperation remained to be seen. Raising his own glass, Henry Lessinger grinned for the public eyes who were continuing to capture the moment for tomorrow's front pages.
I do not doubt that this partnership will prove beneficial to all of you who invested in us as individual entities. Now it's time to send the news to Wall Street and enjoy the windfall of this merger. Ladies and gentlemen, here's to 1929. May it be one unforgettable year for us all.
Flutes were raised in a unified toast. 1929, echoed the crowd. As Lessinger and Rothschild continued to pose for pictures, and the crowd dispersed to discuss this development, Ava gave me a pat on the head. All she was missing was a snout and a bushy tail wagging wildly behind her, and then disappeared into a grove of penguin suits and evening dresses, beaming more brightly than a broadsword fresh from the forge and polished to a fine sheen. The message was clear. I had served my purpose, and I could now leave whenever I felt like it. The quartet started up again. This time they were performing Mozart, a composer I especially liked. Other composers, from both my world and this one, seemed to go easy on the notes and melodies, but this guy really knew how to make his musicians work for their applause.
Mr. Baddins.
Came the familiar voice I was hoping to talk to first thing Monday morning so I could explain everything. Miss Lessinger, believe me when I tell you, this is an unexpected pleasure.
Really?
Oh, yeah, she was in a lather, all right.
Is there a reason you're here? With Ava, no less?
Actually, I'm on my own now, I replied with a slight shrug. Miss Rothschild invited me here, so I showed up in my best double-breasted to what I thought was the Rothschild mansion and hoped for the best. It wasn't until I saw you that I realized I was being played for a sucker. Looks like Ava was intending for you to drop me, and drop me quick. I would like to think that, in light of my past service to you, I can continue to disappoint her. I motioned to a grand patio that presented no real view, apart from a grove of trees. There were a few guests out there enjoying the clear night sky, their smokes, and quiet chit-chat. Perhaps we should get some fresh air. No offense, but I find the surroundings here...
Stuffy, I know.
Miss Lessinger turned up a nose, and with a final disdainful glance at the party around her, led the way outside. The conversation out here was even less substantial than the talk I'd eavesdropped on earlier. What I noticed here were the boys in their slick-back hair determined to enjoy the company of whatever lady they happened to be chatting with. This, I could only assume, was the optimum place to close a deal and bring home the goods. The goods being anything from marriage to a business merger or just a good night of grundlemalking. So, Miss Lessinger, concerning Tony, she was about to place a cigarette between a pair of freshly decorated lips when her head turned down to me sharply, her voice a harsh whisper.
Mr. Baddins, this is not the time.
Well, if you whisper like that and attract attention to yourself by not acting normally, then yeah, this isn't the time nor the place. Or did you notice that when you came out here, no one seemed to care? I watched her resume the lighting of her cigarette, nonchalantly looking around her as she blew her first drag smoke away from us. I didn't have a care about becoming the focus of the others' attentions. Judging from the amount of pheromones being exchanged between couples, we were the farthest things from their minds. Just keep the tone down, I advised. Act as if you don't care and enjoy your smoke. I'll do the talking. From my inner pocket, I produced my mini pipe. Little indulgence with about the size of my palm and good for social situations like this. Then I pulled out a small pouch of weed and packed the bowl. I was relieved when she struck a match for me and lit my smoke as I suckled on the other end of the pipe. She was still miffed, but maybe not as much as I initially thought. Thanks, Miss Lessinger. I finally got a taste of the sweet leaf, and with a nod to her, I also puffed out a cloud of smoke to the shadows nearby, just to make certain no one was listening in on us. You wanted to know why Tony was bumped off, I began. And while I got a handle on the why, I'm not so sure about the who anymore. Seems that Tony wanted to enter the antiques business. His first score, though, was an item in popular demand. The supplier Tony tried to connect with, your good Dr. Hamill at the Ryerson, in fact, was already in bed with many of the folks here tonight, selling off quite a few museum finds for a tidy profit, then rewriting history in the acquisition department.
No.
Miss Lessinger's mouth fell open in surprise.
Dr. Hamill was illegally selling off some of the Ryerson's inventory?
Maybe not the most premier ones, but yeah. He was enjoying his own little side business and some of the perks of upper-tier society, unbeknownst to the Ryerson staff. And this is where we get confused with the who behind Tony's death.
But we know that Capone was behind it.
She shrugged. We know that, but someone had to knock that arrow and light it. It could either have been someone inside Tony DeMaio's inner circle or the supplier himself.
Dr. Hamill could have killed Tony, you mean?
He could have been instrumental in some way. It wouldn't surprise me if he was the one who ratted out DeMaio to Capone's organization. I paused to draw from my pipe, studying her partially lit face. With her volunteer connection to the Ryerson, it was hard to believe she was entirely in the dark over Hamill's shenanigans. But something tells me that some of these facts come as no surprise to you. She balanced the cigarette between two fingers, her expression growing pensive.
You're referring to the score. I imagine you mean the singing sword, don't you?
She then threw a slider that only Bruce Cunningham could conjure.
I saw it when I first arrived in Chicago.
I nearly coughed on my weed. She saw the damn thing? I think I liked this case better when it was just a mob hit. Now my client was linked to this talisman from my old stomping grounds. Just at the point where I thought I had this case closed. Really, Miss Lessinger? I said evenly, trying not to give away my total astonishment.
Julie, please. Miss Lessinger makes me sound like my mother.
Okay, Julie, I replied with a nod. Gazing up at the stars for a moment, I decided to keep her talking about the sword. I needed to find out how much she knew, which I was praying to the fates wasn't a lot. You know, I keep feeling as if I'm on the verge of opening a case within a case. What's with all this fuss over this particular trinket?
It's a find that archaeologists dream about, Billy.
Her eyes caught the light from the mansion, and I could hear it in her voice. This was something that fascinated her, unlike anything she had ever known.
Imagine a sword of European design discovered in a sealed tomb of ancient Egypt. Mysteries like this singing sword are cornerstones that thesis symposiums and careers are built on.
Then her tone changed. She sounded disappointed.
But sadly, it was Ava who found it. This was going to be her greatest find, provided that she took care to consult her on-site archaeologist about what she found, that is.
You insinuated in my office that Ava was a bit of a loose cannon at the Ryerson.
She supposedly studied history at the finishing school her father shipped her off to, but I doubt that she'd know the value of a true find unless it came from Tiffany's. That doesn't deter her from being a little too quick in alerting the press sometimes. Since the tomb of King Tutankhamun was discovered back in 22, archaeology has been all the rage. Eva convinced her daddy to finance her overseas adventures. I was privy to the reports from the Ryerson's staff. She only showed up on site when something was discovered, ready to take credit for it. I also learned that the real archaeologists were thrilled when Eva was somewhere other than the site.
She shook her head in exasperation and contempt.
I still remember the day we received a wire declaring that Ava had discovered the true resting place of King Tut.
Safe to assume that her revolutionary find was nothing more than a scam cooked up by the local boys? Julie nodded, taking a quick puff of her cigarette. Did little to mask the bitterness in her face.
If she had succeeded in going public with the discovery, it would have been the iceberg to Ryerson's Titanic. She's a benefactor, and that gives her some sway. But I've watched Hamill and his staff avoid potentially disastrous situations. Once they received Eva's wire about the singing sword, it became a top priority to keep her quiet.
Filing that nugget away, I went on. So being the lowly volunteer, how did you manage to get a glimpse of it, let alone get access to these sensitive wires?
You've met Dr. Hamill. You've seen the condition of his office. I tried to find reasons to go there so I could catch a glance at what was on his desk.
She chuckled, quite pleased with her resourcefulness.
I assure you, Billy, I wasn't supposed to be on the inside of anything. Hamill loved to make it clear that I was only a volunteer. When acquisitions arrived from various digs, I merely assisted with the registering and tagging. Nothing more than busy work. But it would still infuriate my father if he were to ever find out I'm connected with an institution he despises so much. It was an opportunity I couldn't pass up, menial as the administrative work is, because any experience at the Ryerson is bound to lead me on to bigger and better things. Besides,
she added with a suggestive wink,
sometimes I could push that envelope with Hamill and extend the boundaries of my position.
Being the looker she was, I bet she pushed pretty hard. So how much could you get away with? She grinned modestly.
Oh, not as much as you'd think. But I did get an inside peek at acquisitions from time to time. When the singing sword arrived, I was at the right place at the right time. I was the only volunteer in acquisitions that day, along with 2 full-time staff members.
She paused, a smile absently forming on her face at the memory.
Billy, you should have seen it. It looked as if it had been created only yesterday. Not a single scratch, blemish, or mark on it. All of us were taken by it.
The smile faded, and so did the wonder in her voice.
Hamill was apparently expecting its arrival, but he'd gotten caught in traffic across town. I'd never seen him so angry when he caught us cataloging it. He swore to fire all of us, even me, the volunteer, if word got out the singing sword had arrived. It was pretty frightening, Billy. For a moment, I thought he was actually going to use it on us. The next day, I was barred from acquisitions altogether. It was back to sorting books and taking head counts of school groups.
So, Doc Hamill wasn't beyond threatening a Lessinger. He really did think this sword was his ticket. And to assure her silence along with 2 other staff members. He must have been a real demon that day. Doesn't sound like the most exciting of jobs. This girl could have whatever she wanted in life, and yet she chose to suffer in the trenches at the Ryerson. She had to have a good reason. So why did you stay?
Because my father has mandated that I stay in Chicago.
She replied with a sigh.
If I leave, I'm on my own, financially as well as personally. I've been fascinated by ancient cultures and relics ever since I was a little girl visiting the castles of Europe and the pyramids of Egypt. And I excelled in art and anthropology classes in college. The Ryerson is the best place to explore all those interests at once.
Not the only place, Julie.
No, but the best. Even as a volunteer cataloging rare finds. Had Dr. Hamill simply told my father what he wanted to hear about our family's lineage, I could have held a very prominent position at the Ryerson.
Her face twisted in disgust.
But my position, such as it is, was still lofty enough to catch the attention of a mobster. I guess it's true what they say about institutions of higher learning.
What do the all-knowing they say? I asked.
That you trade common sense for a college degree.
She smirked.
You would think I'm smart enough to tell when I'm being played.
Considering the way tonight went for me, I can tell you this. It happens to the best of us. Julie winked at me.
I should have warned you about Ava. She loved to join Tony and me whenever she was in town, and she was either Benny's date or some guy named Paulie, something like that. It was pathetic watching her try and wedge herself between the two of us. I put nothing past her.
After tonight, neither would I. I also wouldn't have put anything past Julie Lessinger. Not that Julie was in the same class as Ava, mind you. I'm just dwarf enough to admit that my first impression of her being the spoiled rich bitch was far from accurate. For one thing, I hadn't pinned her as someone passionate about academic pursuits. From the pictures in the news rags, she seemed more prone to hot jazz, cocktails, and parties that outlasted the night, not researching and identifying treasure from ancient tombs. Second, I had to grudgingly acknowledge the luck she possessed. To be a volunteer who, at best, was given the grunt work no one else wanted, and she winds up being one of the few people in Chicago to see the singing sword? Not bad, Julie. Not bad. Wish I had that kind of luck when rolling the bones. You know, Julie, just because old Sam Hamill believed himself on a higher plane didn't mean it was the truth. I think the doc was as much in the dark on the singing sword mystery as anyone.
Really? What makes you say that?
Let's just say we had a heart-to-heart over it before he died. All he was certain of was its worth to his reputation. If he were able to figure out how the singing sword came to appear in an ancient Egyptian tomb, it would be an accomplishment that would shake things up in his academic circles. Plus, it would get him out from under the thumb of whoever was keeping him in the black market. I took another long drag before continuing with a hunch I needed to play concerning Julie and her take on tonight. Not to mention her earlier comments about Hamill. Like this merger between your father and Rothschild. Quite an accomplishment, it sounds like. As she looked down on me, strictly a height thing in this case, Julia kept her cigarette close, the smoke easing its way from between her lips.
A blessing?
She shook her head, trying not to laugh.
Do you know why this merger's happening?
I didn't bother to shake my head. I had a feeling Julie was going to tell me either way. She was wound up like a clockwork scene moving as fast as the music and its gears could run.
Neither the Rothschilds nor the Lessingers had boys. Just me and Ava. Our fathers, in between their bouts of outdoing and outdonating one another, have been trying to figure out what to do with the empires they've built. After all, women do not make good businessmen.
Does Ava share your disdain of this merger?
You were standing next to her when her father made that grandchildren wisecrack. Both our fathers are hoping beyond hope we'll get married before they die, so they can pass on the business to their son-in-laws or male grandchildren.
Julie gave me a smirk.
I suppose we turned out to be disappointments, Mr. Baddins.
Billy, Mr. Baddins makes me sound like my father, I said with a wink.
Billy.
Her smile suited her. She should do it more often, I thought to myself as she went on.
My father would have been a happier man if I were his son and not his daughter. But at least I'm my own person and not pretending to be something else merely to please Daddy, unlike my counterpart.
Well, your counterpart will be facing a disappointment in her future, equal to that of discovering the singing sword without getting the credit. I'll bet you a coffer of gold coins she'll be sauntering into my office first thing Monday morning, so sure I have lost a somewhat profitable client that she'll probably try and undercut my normal fee.
What makes you think I'm not going to fire you now, Billy?
Julie asked, a dark eyebrow slowly arching as she took another long draw from her cigarette, bathing her face in a warm orange glow. Well, the fact that you're calling me Billy, that you're still talking to me, and that you're wearing a sweet smile are all subtle hints that you're not too pissed. So now that you at least know the why behind Tony DeMaio's passing, I guess the only thing for me to do is close this case and bill you for services rendered. She took one final puff of the cigarette before dropping it to the stone floor of the patio, grinding it out with a single quick twist of her high-heeled foot.
You're right, Billy. At least now I know that Tony was killed over the singing sword, even if the rest of the answers remain out of reach.
Spoken like a true apprentice, I said with a confident nod. Her eyes stayed with mine for a moment, and I gave a delighted chuckle. Julie had just unwittingly quoted a good number of apprentices I'd known in my day. It was always the apprentice's duty to shuttle weapons, books, and the assorted talismans back and forth from a study to a battlefield, always watching from the dugout when the mages cast those home-run spells. It was not out of the ordinary to hear an apprentice say something like,
"The stone of Ifia remains out of reach."
Gotta love those apprentices. Sorry, that's just a saying I heard a lot when I was growing up, I explained. About things being out of reach, I mean.
Must have been one interesting place where you grew up, Billy.
She smiled warmly. I decided to test the waters. Well, I won't lie to you. Mountain dragons were a severe pain in the ass. Julia let out a titter, shaking her head in exasperation at my hometown references.
Billy, what are you talking about?
Those things get cranky and stay cranky until food is brought to them, and in many cases, that food takes the form of some virginal sacrifice. Still, an easier choice compared to the other option.
Okay, I'll play in your imagination for a spell.
Her head tilted to one side, sending a few locks of midnight black hair across her forehead.
And what was the other option?
Send in the exterminators. I tapped my pipe on the heel of my polished black shoes and placed it back in my jacket's inner pocket. It was time to head inside, if not head on home. Julie, I said with a polite smile, it was definitely an experience working for you. I'm going to call a cab, then call it a night. I'll write up a final bill for you Monday morning.
Billy, there's no reason for you to call a cab. Considering how dull my father's friends are, you'll probably be asleep somewhere in the estate by the time it gets here. Believe me, I know these types. The Egyptian mummies I catalogued for the Ryerson are livelier than this crowd. I'll have my driver take you home.
I appreciate that, Julie. And I did. A cab ride from here would severely bite into the profits of this case.
Look for the silver-gray car, black top, pulling up in, say, 10 minutes?
See your driver in 10. I nodded. Good night. Julie seemed to float back into the party like a wraith across the battlements of a haunted watchtower. Her head lifted slightly and a gentle hand raised in greeting, a greeting that eventually came to rest on another's shoulder. One of those obtuse friends of the family, no doubt. Now that she was in the light of the Lessinger mansion, I could enjoy the sight of her before she moved off to call for her driver. She was still my Lady Trouble. I knew that for sure, because she was bringing back to me an aspect of my life that I thought was far behind me and best left there. The final bill from Julie would hold Miranda and the business well off for a few months, and I didn't foresee any extravagant expenses in tracking down the sword. I had to keep a profile so low that a Tresillian swamp worm would look tall to me. Still, there was some solace in realizing I had closed this case and managed to stay above ground. I must be getting better at this detective thing. Too bad the whole private part of this job prevented me from sounding my own war horn over this. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, hire the only dwarf able to poke his pudgy nose into Al Capone's business and live to talk about it. It would have made one hell of a radio advertisement. Just thinking his name slapped me harder than a mace. Capone would probably give me a few weeks of peace, and then expect me to begin my new job as his personal advisor in finding and handling the singing sword. What the hell did I really know about it? Not much, other than
Only the meek and mild could wield it.
the body count was rising, and no one, including the self-proclaimed expert, knew where it was in the greater Chicago area. Now I could see that black sand of death slowly slipping from the top chamber to the bottom in the hourglass of borrowed time. And it was slipping pretty fast. A crisp chill, probably coming off one of the Great Lakes, pinched me on the cheek as I stood, once again, on the stone steps of the estate's entrance, where this evening had started for me a few hours ago. I had to give little Miss Ava an amount of credit for dreaming up this evening, a surefire way to get me right where I live. Instead of parting with a chunk of change for a tux, a client, and a taxicab ride home, I was getting a chauffeur for the return trip, too. Not bad, Baddins, I thought to myself. You were riding with the Guardians tonight. The silver-gray limousine pulled up, its lights flashing for a moment in my eyes as it pulled around the circle of the driveway. A ride worthy of a dwarven emperor or elvish king, only nicer. The limo stood out from the other ebony chariots patiently awaiting their masters. I got a nod from the driver, who stayed put, and readjusted his grip on the steering wheel. With a soft, the passenger door opened automatically. Neat trick, I thought. The driver didn't look like a magician. The magic that opened the door had a different kind of power altogether, and I paused before climbing into the cabin of the limo, raising a bushy eyebrow at the sorceress responsible for the trick.
Sorry for the wait, Billy.
Julie Lessinger smiled.
I had to say goodbye to some people and then sneak out the servants' entrance so I wouldn't get an earful from Daddy.
He won't mind you coming into town at this hour?
I'll be surprised if he notices my absence. Right now, my father's priorities are getting the best photo opportunities.
She slid to the opposite end of the long seat.
Your chariot awaits, Mr. Baddins.
Step into my parlor, said the Dreenek to the Valley Thyr.